Rain hammered the casket, the sky raging with them. Beneath black umbrellas, a daughter with eyes of ice struck, humiliating her father like he was nothing but a stranger. Tomorrow, one reading would flip their world, deciding who held the fortune and the truth, because hidden in her mother's was something no one, not even her, was ready to hear when the lawyer began to say. Rain hammered the casket, the sky raging in unison with the living. Beneath a canopy of black umbrellas, the daughter's face was carved from stone, her eyes cold and unblinking. She moved without hesitation, one swift, calculated step, and her father stumbled under the weight of her public humiliation. Gasps rippled to the mourners, a wave of sharp breaths and lowered whispers, as if the storm above had reached down to crack the ground between them. He straightened slowly, brushing wet grit from his jacket, his gaze never leaving hers. 10 years had passed since he'd last seen her, 10 years since she closed the door on him for good. And now here she stood, looking at him not like blood, not even like an enemy, but like he was nothing at all. Her lips curved into a small, deliberate smile, one that didn't belong at a graveside. Around them, the air was heavy with judgment. People shifted in their coats, trading quick glances, the kind that carried sharp conclusions without words. He felt every pair of eyes, some pitying, most condemning, press against his back. But the daughter's voice cut through them all, clear and venomous. Nice of you to show up, finally. Shame it's too late. He wanted to respond, to tell her there was more to the truth than the picture she'd painted of him. But the funeral was no place to reopen wounds that were already bleeding. Instead, he stood silent, rain dripping from his hair, while she stepped back with the kind of poise that made it clear this was only her opening move. What neither of them knew, what the wind itself seemed to hold back in its breath, was that tomorrow, in a room miles from the cemetery, one reading would change everything. It would decide not only who held the fortune, but who held the truth, and the fallout would burn far deeper than either imagined. The rain kept falling, sharp as pins against the canopy above, but inside the silence between them it felt deafening. She stood inches from him now, the dark silk of her dress catching droplets like tiny shards of glass. Tomorrow, she said softly, but loud enough for those nearest to hear, you'll finally understand what he left behind, and who deserved it. The edges of her words were honed, meant to cut, and they did. He could have turned away, could have let the storm swallow the moment. But something in her gaze, equal parts fury and satisfaction, held him there, like she was daring him to flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, close enough that the scent of her perfume mixed with the cold rain. I didn't come here for anything but respect, he murmured, voice steady, even though his pulse was a drumbeat in his ears. The crowd shifted again, whispers curling to the damp air like smoke. Old acquaintances, strangers in black coats, business partners of the woman in the casket, they all watched, a congregation hungry for the next strike. And it came, sharp and precise, when a figure in a charcoal suit cut through the murmur, his polished shoes splashing in the shallow puddles at the graveside. Mr. Calder, Miss Calder, the man said with the unshakable calm of someone used to delivering news that changes lives. I represent the late Mrs. Calder. There is a matter of her estate, and you are both required to attend the reading. His tone was polite, but there was weight beneath it, a gravity that caught her mid-smirk and pulled it into something unreadable. She laughed, too quickly, too loud for the setting, and turned her eyes back to her father. "Oh, this will be fun," she said, her voice sweet as poison honey. "You get a front-row seat to watch me take everything." But as the lawyer's gaze flickered, just for a heartbeat, to him, a different truth seemed to hang unspoken in the wet air. A truth that, by this time tomorrow, would rip open the seams of everything she thought she knew. Her laugh lingered in the damp air, but the edge in it couldn't hide the faint twitch of uncertainty in her jaw. The lawyer's briefcase clicked shut with deliberate precision, his voice dropping low enough to command attention from everyone still lingering at the graveside. "The reading will be held tomorrow afternoon. Attendance is not optional. Both of you are named." He let the last words hang, heavy and unblinking, before turning toward the waiting car that had been idling at the curb. She didn't move right away. Her eyes followed the lawyer until the door closed, then flicked back to her father with a cold, almost satisfied glint. "I already know how this goes," she said, brushing rain from her cheek, as if wiping away something beneath the surface. Mother didn't build an empire just to give away to someone who abandoned it. The word slid between them like a knife, her tone laced with the same disdain she'd carried for years. He stayed quiet, not because her accusation didn't burn, but because every instinct told him this wasn't the moment to defend himself. There was a strange calm rising inside him, something almost foreign after years of carrying the weight of her judgment. If tomorrow truly held the answers, he could wait. But part of him couldn't ignore the way the lawyer's glance had shifted, just briefly, in his direction before he left. Around them, the crowd was thinning, expensive umbrellas folding shut as guests stepped into sleek cars. A few cast lingering looks, some curious, others uncomfortable, as though they'd witnessed a scene too personal to be part of. The rain had eased to a fine mist, but the tension between father and daughter was still a downpour neither could escape. She tilted her chin, a small, calculated movement that said more than her words. She expected victory. He slipped the lawyer's card into his pocket, the embossed gold letters pressing against his palm like a silent promise. Tomorrow would not go the way she imagined. He didn't know how, but he could feel in the marrow of his bones. And when it happened, when the truth finally broke the surface, it wouldn't just change who held the fortune. It would change who they were to each other forever. That night, the city felt colder than usual, its lights blurred by the mist still hanging in the air. He sat at the small kitchen table in his one-bedroom apartment, the lawyer's car in front of him, its gold lettering catching the dim light. He traced the embossed name with his thumb, not out of admiration, but as if it were a puzzle piece that might reveal the whole picture. The storm outside was quiet now, but inside his chest it hadn't stopped. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time his eyes closed, he saw her face, his daughter, looking at him with that perfected smirk, confident in a victory she hadn't yet won. He wondered if she had rehearsed those words for years, just waiting for a chance to spit them out. Maybe she had. And yet, behind all the steel in her voice, he thought he'd glimpsed something else, a flicker she didn't want him to see. By morning, the rain had cleared, but the air still carried the weight of it. He dressed with care, pulling on the best shirt he owned and a tie he hadn't worn since the last wedding he'd been invited to years ago, before everything had fractured. The subway ride to the lawyer's office was a blur of muted voices and metallic screeches, the kind of in-between space where anticipation builds until it's almost unbearable. The building itself was a pillar of glass and steel, towering above the street like it had nothing to do with the world below. Inside, everything was polished to perfection. Marble floors, walls lined with art that looked like it belonged in a museum, not a law firm. The receptionist's voice was soft but firm as she directed him to the 19th floor, her eyes flicking up once to take his face before returning to her screen. When he stepped into the conference room, the first thing he saw was her, already seated, perfectly put together, her posture screaming confidence. She didn't look up right away, as if acknowledging him would give him too much. When she finally did, her smile was the same one she'd worn at the graveside, controlled, knowing, dangerous. And yet, the air in the room shifted when the lawyer entered. He carried a thick folder, his expression unreadable. "Thank you both for coming," he said, placing the folder on the table as though it weighed more than paper should. "What we're about to go through is significant. I'll ask that you let me finish before reacting." His daughter leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with casual elegance. "I'm sure it'll be quick," she said lightly. "We all know who Mother trusted." The lawyer's fingers rested on the first page, his gaze steady as he looked between them. "You may think you know," he said quietly, "but what's in here may surprise you both." The lawyer opened the folder slowly, the faint rustle of paper the only sound in the room. His daughter leaned back, fingers drumming against the armrest, a picture of controlled anticipation. He sat still, hands folded in his lap, not because he felt calm, but because he refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing his nerves. The air felt heavier with every second the lawyer spent arranging the pages, as if the truth inside them had its own gravity. "To my daughter, Leora Calder," the lawyer began, voice steady, measured, "I leave my property on Seabrook Avenue, along with a sum of $500,000. Her smirk held for a fraction of a second, then faltered. She blinked once, as though she misheard, then sat up straighter. "Is that all?" The lawyer did not answer her question. His gaze shifted to the man across the table. "To my former husband, Elias Calder, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all business assets, investments, real property, totaling approximately $56 million, and full operational control of Calder systems. The word struck like a physical blow. He felt the chair beneath him, but the floor might as well have dropped away. His daughter's voice broke the stunned silence, sharp and disbelieving. No, this is wrong. She would never. Her eyes flashed at the lawyer, then to him, brimming with fury that had nowhere to go. There is more, the lawyer said quietly, lifting a single handwritten page from the folder. She left each of you a personal message. He looked to Leora first. My dear daughter, you have the intelligence to build anything, but you've never learned the value of struggle. What I leave you is enough to start any life you choose, if you choose wisely. The rest I entrust to your father, who knows what it means to build from the ground up. Learn from him. The room fell into a silence so thick it felt alive. Leora's jaw clenched, her nails digging into the polished wood of the table. This is fraud, she spat. Some twisted setup. He must have manipulated her. Her voice rose, brittle and desperate, but the lawyer's calm did not waver. The will is fully validated, with witnesses and a recorded statement from your mother taken 3 months before her death. Elias sat frozen, tried to reconcile the weight of what he'd just been handed. Not just the money, but the responsibility, the company, the legacy, the unspoken challenge buried in her last words. Across the table, his daughter's breathing grew shallow, her composure splintering with each second that passed. And in that moment he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Leora's chair scraped back hard against the marble floor, the sound cutting through the air like a blade. Her eyes locked on him, sharp, accusing, almost shaking with disbelief. And for the first time in years, she didn't bother hiding the raw anger beneath her polished exterior. This is yours doing, she hissed, every syllable trembling with venom. You found a way to twist her, to steal what was mine. Elias didn't rise to her words, though the weight of them landed heavy. I had no idea, he said quietly, but his calm only seemed to inflame her more. She leaned forward, her voice low now, dangerous. Enjoy it while you can, because the moment I walk out of here, I'm tearing this apart, piece by piece, until you're left with nothing. The lawyer remained still, letting the threat hang before speaking. Miss Calder, your mother's was executed with full legal protection. Witnesses, notarization, recorded testimony. No manipulation is possible, but his words didn't touch her. She was already halfway to the door, gathering her bag with movements sharp enough to slice through the tension in the room. Elias watched her go, the echo of her heels on the polished floor striking like a countdown. Somewhere deep inside, he knew she wouldn't just vanish into storm. She would come back, angrier, louder, armed with everything she thought could undo this. And yet, a strange clarity settled over him. The fight ahead wasn't about the money. It was about the truth she'd spent years refusing to see. Her hand was on the door handle when she turned back, eyes burning with a promise. You think this is over? Tomorrow the war begins. She left without waiting for a reply, the heavy door slamming shut behind her, leaving the conference room steeped in a silence that was somehow louder than the storm outside. Elias exhaled slowly, the enormity of what he'd been handed pressing against him from every angle. $56 million, a company he hadn't touched in over a decade, and the daughter he barely knew anymore, ready to destroy him to get it back. Elias stayed seated long after the echo of the door faded, his reflection caught faintly in the dark sheen of the conference table. The lawyer closed the folder with a quiet snap, sliding it toward him as though handing over a weapon he didn't yet know how to use. This isn't just an inheritance, he said, his tone steady but weighted. It's an empire, and it will draw attention, wanted or not. The ride down from the 19th floor felt longer than it should have. Glass walls revealed the city below, alive with movement, but muffled and distant. In the lobby, people moved with purpose, unaware that a man in their midst had just been handed the kind of power most never touched. He stepped outside, the air cool, the pavement slick from an earlier rain, and yet his mind burned with what lay ahead. That night, he stood at the window of his apartment, the city lights scattered like constellations on wet asphalt. He could see her face as clearly as if she were standing across from him again, the same fury, the same defiance. But beneath it, He recognized something that had once been his, the need to win at any cost. He knew she wouldn't back down, not because she needed the money, but because she couldn't stand to lose to him. 2 days later, the first shot landed. A letter, crisp, embossed, delivered by courier, announcing her legal intent to challenge the will. He sat at the table, the words blurring slightly as he read, then read again. The claims were sharp and personal. Manipulation, undue influence, coercion. It was a war she intended to fight in the open. And somewhere inside, Elias felt the first real shift, not fear, but something colder, more dangerous. He wasn't just going to defend what had been left to him. He was going to show her, piece by piece, why their mother had made this choice. The letter lay open on the table, its black ink crisp and merciless against the white page. It wasn't just a legal document. It was a declaration of war. Every sentence carried her voice, even though she hadn't written herself, accusing him of exploiting grief, of twisting trust, of stealing something she believed was hers by right. The sting wasn't in the words, but in knowing she had chosen to fight him this way instead of facing him. By the time he met with the firm representing him, the city had already turned gray under a low ceiling of clouds. The attorney assigned to his case, a man with the stillness of someone who thrived in high-stakes rooms, laid out the strategy like a general before battle. Witnesses, recorded testimony, financial records tracing the late matriarch's decisions back over a year. "We don't just defend," the lawyer said quietly. "We dismantle their claims before they can draw blood." The first hearing arrived faster than expected. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a place where truth and performance lived side by side. Leora swept in with her legal team, 3 sharp-suited professionals whose confidence clung to them like expensive cologne. She didn't glance at him, but her posture screamed that this was her arena, and she expected to win. When her lead attorney rose, the room seemed to lean forward. "Your Honor," he began, "this man manipulated a dying woman, played on guilt on history, to seize control of her life's work." The words were delivered with precision, their venom wrapped in politeness. And yet Elias didn't flinch. Not when they spoke of abandonment. Not when they painted him as a man who had taken advantage of her final days. Because he knew what was coming. His attorney stood, voice even but carrying the weight of proof. Exhibits unfolded like cards in a winning hand. Video footage of her speaking alone to the camera, steady and lucid. Statements from her closest colleagues. Timeline showing she'd been planning this exact outcome long before her health had faltered. Piece by piece, the accusations unraveled until nothing remained but the silence of a losing position. And across the aisle, for just a heartbeat, he saw it. The first crack in her armor. Her gaze locked on the screen as the final clip played. Their mother's voice, steady and unwavering, filling the courtroom. There was no hesitation in her tone, no sign of confusion or coercion. She spoke of intention, of trust, of knowing exactly what she wanted her legacy to be. And when she named him as the one to carry it forward, her words had the quiet finality of a sealed fate. The judge's eyes lingered on Leora for a moment before shifting back to the defense. A few pages turned, signatures confirmed, and a ruling came down with a weight of gavel that didn't even need to fall. The court finds no evidence of fraud or undue influence. The will stands as written. It was clean, unshakable, and irreversible. Leora's fingers curled against the table, knuckles pale under the strain. Her attorneys were already gathering their files, the efficiency of defeat in their movements. Elias didn't celebrate. He didn't even exhale. He simply watched her, the air between them a silent battlefield where no verdict could repair the damage. She finally stood, her chair scraping against the polished floor, the sound sharp enough to draw glances. She didn't look at him until she reached the aisle. When she did, it was with a smile that had no warmth, only promise. "This isn't the end," she murmured, low enough for only him to hear. "You've just made an enemy who has nothing left to lose." Then she walked out, her heels striking each step like a countdown he could almost feel in his bones. And in that moment, Elias understood, when the court's judgment had only lit the fuse. The real explosion was still coming. Elias stepped out of the courthouse into a wind that seemed sharper than when he'd arrived. The street was alive with honking taxis and the murmur of strangers, but all he could hear was her last sentence, an enemy who has nothing left to lose. It wasn't just a threat. It was a vow, and he knew her well enough to understand that when Leora made a vow, she followed it like a compass needle locked on true north. He walked for blocks without realizing where his feet were taking him, the weight of the company's keys in his pocket feeling heavier with each step. Calder Systems was now his to lead, but he'd inherited more than an empire. He'd inherited the responsibility to protect it, even from his own blood, and there was no handbook for that. 2 weeks later, he stood in the top-floor office that now bore his name on the door. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, but he wasn't looking at the view. He was reading the quarterly report stacked across his desk. Every figure, every projection, every legacy decision his late ex-wife had made. It was as if she had built this place knowing someone would need to take the helm under fire. Then came the email. Short, untraceable. No greeting, no sign-off, just 6 words that made the muscles in his jaw tighten. You won't see it coming, Father. His gut told him it wasn't empty. Leora had been silent since the verdict, and silence was not her style. She was moving in shadows now, and that was far more dangerous than her standing in front of him screaming accusations. Elias closed a laptop, staring out at the city lights beginning to spark against the dusk. She was out there, somewhere, building something, maybe an attack in court, maybe something outside it. But he could feel the air thickening around him, the way it does before a storm that no one can outrun. The message haunted him long after the screen went dark. It wasn't the words alone. It was the certainty behind them, the knowledge that Leora never bluffed. If she said something was coming, it was already in motion, and whatever she was planning, it wouldn't just be an attack on him. She would go for the company, because that was the one thing he couldn't walk away from. The next morning, Elias arrived at Calder Systems earlier than usual. The office floors were still half-lit, the hum of the elevators echoing in the stillness. He walked the length of the main corridor. Every glass-walled office a reminder the hundreds of employees depending on him to keep this place standing. On his desk, a stack of overnight reports waited, most of them routine, except for one. It was a flag memo from internal security. Someone had attempted to access restricted financial files after hours. The login credentials belonged to a junior accountant who swore they'd been at home all night. The timestamp was just before midnight. Elias knew better than to believe in coincidences. This wasn't a random breach. Someone had planted themselves inside the walls. By noon, he was in a closed-door meeting with the company's head of security, reviewing grainy camera footage frame by frame. A figure in a hooded coat, moving with calculated purpose, avoided every camera angle except one, a fleeting, partial glimpse as they stepped into the server room. It wasn't enough to identify them, but enough to know they weren't guessing where to go. Whoever it was had been coached. Elias leaned back, the weight of the chair pressing into his shoulders. There was no need to guess who might be behind it. Leora wasn't just coming from anymore. She was already inside, testing the locks before she kicked the door wide open by the end of the day. Elias had every department head in a secure meeting room, the blinds drawn, the air charged with unease. He laid out the breach, the timing, the precision of the intruder's movements. No one spoke at first, just a low rustle of papers and the faint hum of the overhead lights. This wasn't random, he said finally, his voice even but firm. Someone knew exactly where to look, and someone gave them that knowledge. A few exchanged glances, the kind that held silent accusations, but no one dared say her name. He didn't need them to. He could feel her presence in this, like a shadow stretching across the room. Leora had always been meticulous, strategic. When she wanted something, she studied every angle until the outcome was inevitable. If she had someone on the inside, it meant she was already 3 moves ahead. That night, he walked the empty halls of Calder Systems alone. The city skyline glowed beyond the glass walls, but his focus stayed on the hum of the servers behind locked doors. He rested a hand on the cool steel, listening as if the machines themselves could warn him of what was coming. The truth was, he wasn't afraid of losing the money, or even the company. He was afraid of what it would do to her to burn everything down just to win. In his office, A single envelope waited on the desk, unmarked. Inside was a single printed page. Some things are meant to be taken back. No signature. No need for one. Elias folded the note slowly, his jaw tightening. This was no longer about inheritance. This was about legacy, and she was coming to destroy us before he could even build it. Elias kept the note in his hand long after he'd read it, the thin paper somehow carrying the weight of a brick. The office was silent but for the faint hum of the air vents, yet he felt as though the walls themselves were leaning in, listening. Outside the window, the city was a scatter of lights, each one a life, moving forward, unaware of the war beginning high above their heads. He slid the note into the top drawer, locking it, though he knew it wasn't the kind of threat a lock could stop. The next morning began with fire, not literal flames, but the kind that spread fast through whispers and forwarded emails. A confidential memo detailing Calder Systems' upcoming merger negotiations had been leaked to the press. By noon, the story was everywhere: blogs, business channels, even talk radio. The markets reacted instantly, the company's stock dipping as speculation roared. It wasn't just embarrassing. It was surgical. He called an emergency board meeting, the conference table packed with faces tight with suspicion. Some looked to him for answers. Others avoided his eyes, already deciding where blame should fall. Elias explained the breach, the timing, the precision, pointing to the same truth he'd been living with since the courtroom. This was deliberate. This was personal. A voice from the far end of the table cut through the low murmurs. "You're suggesting sabotage, but from whom?" Elias didn't answer immediately. His gaze traveled the length of the table, resting for a fraction too long on an empty chair. It was reserved for a shareholder who had excused themselves from recent meetings. One Leora had been close to since her early days in the company. After the meeting, in the privacy of his office, he stared at the skyline again, but this time it felt like standing on a cliff edge. She wasn't just circling anymore. She was inside the walls, pulling at the foundation. And if he didn't move first, the next strike might not just weaken him. It could bring the whole building down. That night, the city was a sheet of black glass beneath him, the reflection of office lights stretching into the dark like warning signals. Elias stayed long after the last employee had gone, reviewing every internal communication, every security log, every board member's recent activity. The pattern was subtle, but it was there, a thread of influence winding its way from one compromised staffer to another, tightening like a noose. And at the center of it, her name never written but unmistakable in the moves. By morning, he had double security clearances, sealed financial servers behind two-factor gates, and ordered forensic audits of all communications for the past 6 months. Whispers traveled fast, and by midday the building's atmosphere had shifted. Employees moved in hushed tones, their eyes darting, sensing the invisible line between loyalty and suspicion. Elias knew he had to act before fear began doing her work for her. The break came unexpectedly. A mid-level analyst, pale and sweating under the heat of a closed-door interview, admitted to passing files to an outside consultant. No name, no physical description, but the description of the pickup location, a cafe in the old district, was enough to snap everything into focus. Elias didn't need confirmation to know who had been waiting there. That evening, he walked to the narrow streets of the old district himself, the scent of rain still hanging in the air. The cafe's windows glowed amber against the dark, and for a fleeting second, he imagined walking inside to find her already seated, smiling like this was some twisted family reunion. He didn't go in. Not yet. This wasn't the time for a scene. This was a war timing, and his moment hadn't arrived. But as he turned away, a single thought dug in and refused to let go. She wasn't just undermining him. She was daring him to catch her. And when he finally did, there would be no going back for either of them. 2 nights later, Elias was alone again, the glow of his desk lamp painting his face in a tired bronze. Outside, the city's heartbeat slowed to the hum of distant traffic, but his own pulse quickened with every new piece of the puzzle clicking into place. In a locked drawer, the analyst's testimony lay beside financial traces, small, deliberate withdrawals from accounts that should have been dormant. They led to shell companies in jurisdictions where names disappeared into air, and yet the signature moves were hers. The first trap was almost too easy. An invitation disguised as a legal inquiry, sent through an intermediary she had used before. If she took the bait, she'd have to move funds or files, something tangible. By morning, the intermediary replied with a single encrypted attachment. Elias didn't open it in his office. He took it to a secure terminal in a basement room that smelled faintly of ozone and dust, every keystroke echoing like a countdown. When the file unfolded, his breath caught. It wasn't a financial ledger or a contract. It was a series of high-resolution photographs, some of them of board members, some of private meetings, some of him, each one framed as if through a sniper scope, each time-stamped within the last 3 weeks. She wasn't just dismantling his control. She had been close enough to watch him without his knowing. A sharp knock at the basement door pulled him back. It was one of his most trusted aides, eyes wide with something between fear and disbelief. "You need to see this," she whispered, placing a fresh envelope in his hand. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper with 3 words in clean, deliberate ink. "Your move, Elias." Somewhere in the city, she was waiting for him to take it. And now he had no choice but to decide whether his next step would draw her closer or put him exactly where she wanted him. Elias didn't move for a long moment, the paper resting in his palm like it weighed more than steel. 3 words, neat, precise, and deliberate, were enough to strip the air from the room. His aide shifted uncomfortably, waiting for orders, but he only folded the page once, twice, and slipped it into his jacket. This wasn't a warning. It was an invitation, and he knew accepting it could cost him more than his position. That night, he left the office through the underground garage, bypassing his usual driver. The streets were slick from a late shower, neon lights bleeding into puddles that rippled under the slow, calculated roll of his tires. He wasn't heading home. Instead, he followed a map burned into his memory, a network of alleyways and unmarked doors he had used years ago when information didn't travel on paper, but in whispers and shadows. In a crumbling brick building on the edge of the district, he found the man he needed. Vaughn, if that was still his name, sat behind a battered desk with cigarette smoke curling lazily in the stale air. No greetings, no wasted words. Elias slid an old brass key across the wood, its teeth filed to fit a vault that should have been sealed years ago. Inside that vault was leverage, the kind that didn't just win fights, it ended them. By the time Vaughn returned, he carried not a file, but a small black recorder, the kind that clicked when you wound it by hand. Elias pressed play, and a voice, hers, spilled into the room. Calm, certain, speaking of numbers, names, and instructions meant to dismantle him piece by piece. But then a pause. A single phrase, quiet enough to be almost lost in the static. "Tell him I'm not finished." Elias' jaw tightened. The low hum of the recorder, winding down until the room was silent again. She wanted him to hear this. Not to threaten, but to provoke. The only question was, what move could he make now, knowing she had already mapped the board in her favor? Elias stayed seated long after the recorder's click faded into the stale air, his fingertips tracing the edge of the table as if the grain of the wood might reveal the next move. Outside, the wind scraped against the cracked window panes, rattling them, like impatient fingers on glass. Vaughn didn't speak. He didn't have to. Both men knew that this wasn't just a message from the dead. It was a rope being thrown into the pit, daring him to climb or be buried. When he finally stood, his shadow stretched long across the peeling floorboards, fractured by the single swaying bulb above. He left without a word, the brass key heavy in his pocket, the recorder heavier still in his hand. On the street, the rain had started again, not a steady drizzle, but sharp, cold needles that found their way beneath his collar. Every step toward his car felt like walking deeper into a night that wasn't entirely his own. Back at his apartment, he locked the door twice, then slid the chain into place. The city hummed faintly beyond the walls, but inside it was only the soft creak of old wood and a faint tick of the clock. He played the recording again, this time alone, leaning against the counter with a glass in hand. Her voice filled the small space like she was standing just behind him, close enough to breathe the same air. And then he caught something he'd missed before, not in her words, but in the faint background. A door closing, footsteps, and the muffled sound of someone answering her. He froze. That meant she wasn't alone when she recorded it, which meant whoever was in that room might still be alive. And if they were, then they knew far more than he did. Elias didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dim light of the kitchen, the recorder on the table in front of him, replaying that faint sound over and over. Every time, his mind painted it clearer. The soft click of a latch, the almost hesitant shuffle of feet, and then that voice, low, indistinct, but unmistakably male. By dawn, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and glistening under a pale gray sky. He left without breakfast, his coat collar pulled high, moving with the quiet urgency of someone who knew that hesitation was dangerous. The address on the envelope burned in his mind, each block bringing him closer to a door he had never known existed until last night. When he found it, the building looked tired, brick faded, windows clouded with dust, the kind of place people pass without a second glance. He climbed the stairs slowly, every creak underfoot louder than it should have been. At the top, he paused, hand hovering over the doorframe, and there it was again, a voice. The same one, this time clearer. It was talking about her, about the plan she never had the courage to carry out, about the money, about someone else who wouldn't see a cent. And then it said his name. Elias stepped back, heart hammering, so hard it felt like it might shake the whole hallway. Whoever was inside didn't just know her. They knew him. And if they knew him, then maybe they'd been waiting. Elias stayed frozen in that narrow hallway, his breath shallow, every muscle caught between running and breaking down the door. The voice inside carried a strange calm, the kind that didn't rush, like the speaker believed there was no chance of being overheard. Words drifted to the gap beneath the door, curling into his ears like smoke. He couldn't wave away. He'll take the bait. He always does. And when he does, it's ours. The scrape of a chair, footsteps moving closer to the door. Elias stepped back into the shadow of the stairwell, his pulse pounding so loudly he was certain it would give him away. He gripped the railing, knuckles white, watching as the handle turned from the inside. A sliver of light cut across the hallway, illuminating dust in the air, and then a man emerged. Broad shoulders, weathered face, eyes like polished steel, and a faint, knowing smirk that froze Elias in place. The man locked the door behind him without looking, slipped the key into his coat, and started down the stairs. For a moment, Elias thought about following, but something made him turn toward the door instead. That voice, those words, they weren't meant for anyone else. And if this was a trap, he'd already stepped into it. His fingers closed around the cold metal knob, and the instant he pushed, the stale air inside wrapped around him like a warning. Papers on the table, a photograph face down, and in the center of the room, an envelope with his name written in her handwriting. Elias stood in the doorway, the dim lamplight making the dust motes swirl like restless spirits. The envelope with his name seemed to hum in the silence, daring him to touch it. He stepped forward, each creak of the floorboards feeling like it might snap the fragile air holding the room together. He picked it up. The paper was heavy, thick enough to feel expensive, yet its edges were worn, handled too many times by someone unsure whether to deliver it. His thumb traced over her looping handwriting, a style he hadn't seen since before everything fractured. For a moment, he simply held it, afraid that whatever was inside would burn through everything he still believed about her. The flap tore with a soft rip. Inside, one sheet of folded stationery, faintly scented with the lavender oil she always kept in the dresser by her window. He opened it, eyes scanning the first lines, and the words stopped him cold. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't an explanation. It was a warning. A list of names, some he recognized, others he didn't, followed by a single sentence that made his skin crawl. They will come for you after the reading. A sudden noise behind him, a floorboard groaning in the hall. Elias turned sharply, but the doorway was empty. Yet he knew, with the certainty of someone who's already too deep in the game, that he wasn't alone in the house anymore. The silence broke with the faintest scrape, a shoe on the hallway's warped boards. Elias froze, the letter still in his hand, his pulse pounding in his ears. The air felt thicker now, harder to breathe, as though the house itself was holding its breath. From the shadows, a figure emerged. Not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate. A man in a dark coat, face half hidden by the brim of a hat, eyes locked on him like they'd been there all along. "You shouldn't have opened that," the man said quietly, voice edged with something dangerous. Elias stepped back, but his heel caught on the rug, and the letter slipped from his fingers, drifting to the floor like it knew it didn't belong in the light. The man's gaze flicked down to it for the briefest second, and that was when Elias saw the glint of metal in his hand. "Who sent you?" Elias asked, forcing the words past a tightening in his throat. The man's answer was a slow, almost pitying shake of his head. "It's not about who sent me. It's about who's still alive to keep the secret." Then, footsteps outside. Fast, heavy, coming up the porch. The front door rattled. The man's eyes darted toward it, and in that heartbeat of distraction, Elias made his move, grabbing the heavy brass lamp from the table and swinging. It connected with a sickening crack, and the man staggered back, cursing under his breath. But the sound of the front door bursting open drowned everything else. Someone else was here now, and this time, Elias wasn't sure if they were friend or foe. The doorway filled with a silhouette, broad shoulders, rainwater dripping from a hood, breath ragged like they'd been running for miles. The lamplight caught just enough of their face for Elias to see the shock in her eyes before it hardened into something else. Resolve. The stranger stepped inside without asking, their boots leaving wet, dark marks across the floorboards. The man Elias had struck was still on one knee, clutching his head, but his gaze shot to the newcomer with a flicker of recognition and fear. That fear told Elias everything. Whoever this was, they weren't on the same side. "Move," the hooded figure said, their voice low but carrying enough authority to slice through the thick air. Elias hesitated, heart pounding, but something in that tone rooted him in place. Then, in one swift motion, the figure pulled a folded envelope from their coat, tossed it onto the table, and slid a gun across the wood toward Elias. The man on the floor started to rise, spitting blood onto the rug, muttering curses that barely made sense. "You think you know what's in that letter," he growled, "but you don't. You wish you never opened it." Elias's hand hovered over the gun, the weight of the moment pressing in like the walls were closing. The rain outside had softened to a cold drizzle, but inside, the tension only thickened. Two men who wanted him gone, one stranger who seemed to want him armed, and a letter on the table that still burned with questions. And then, just as his fingers curled around the weapon, the hooded figure leaned close and whispered, "The one you're afraid of isn't even in this room." Elias didn't open the letter right away. His grip tightened around the gun, the cold metal anchoring him in a moment that felt both unreal and irreversible. Across the table, the man he'd struck earlier kept his eyes low, jaw tight, as if he was calculating just how much more trouble this night could bring him. The hooded stranger stood perfectly still, watching Elias like they were weighing every flicker of hesitation in his face. Finally, Elias tore the envelope open, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. The letter inside was short, too short for something that could upend everything, but each line read like a match strike. His late wife's handwriting curled across the page, calm and deliberate, revealing a trust, a fortune, and a plan, none of it meant for the daughter who had shunned him, but for someone else entirely. Someone Elias hadn't seen in decades. Someone the letter insisted he find before the week was over. The man on the floor barked a bitter laugh, as if the truth had confirmed something he already knew. "She never trusted you," he spat. "She trusted me to make sure you never found her." The hooded stranger stepped forward, their shadow stretching across the letter, voice cutting to the tension like glass. "And she trusted me to make sure you do." Elias felt the ground shift beneath him. Every betrayal, every cold glance at the funeral, every unanswered question now pointed towards something much deeper than family spite. This wasn't just about money. It was about who his wife really was, and why people were willing to risk their lives to control her final wish. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, but the night air carried a sharp, electric edge, like the pause before a storm breaks again. Elias pocketed the letter, met the hooded stranger's gaze, and realized there was no turning back. The next step would pull him into a past he'd tried to bury, one that refused to stay dead. Because the truth wasn't hidden in a safe or a bank or even in that letter. The truth was walking toward him right now, and it knew his name,